So now we're going to move into a time about talking a little bit about things that don't necessarily have to do with Lyndon B. Johnson. Chief Justice Earl Warren was appointed under Eisenhower. He's a strong believer in personal rights and puts them as a constitutional preference. So your First Amendment rights, we're going to see a lot of the things that the decisions that he will have a hand in and will hand down will have to do with those things. So I'm going to say some things that aren't on the screen. I need you to write them down. So Brown versus Board, we know desegregate schools. It requires that districts and states redraw their districts for the population so that each district has roughly the same number of people so that schools will not be based on race and kids go to certain schools. So that sort of idea. Gideon versus Wainwright and Escobedo versus Illinois and Miranda versus Arizona are all rights of the accused. So write this down next to Gideon versus Wainwright. It established that people accused of a crime have a right to a lawyer even if they can't afford it. So you have a right to a lawyer. One will be appointed to you if you can't afford it. Escobedo versus Illinois ruled that one has the right to a lawyer from the time of arrest or when you become a suspect, essentially. So your right to a lawyer begins when they're investigating you. And Miranda versus Arizona, your Miranda rights required that people be informed of their right to a lawyer and their right not to testify against themselves. So make sure those things are written off to the side. I will be checking in. Basically, Miranda rights is you have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you. If you want to learn more about that, take my criminal law and justice class. We will also see that school prayer will be banned and religious exercises in public school will be banned because Earl Warren saw those as an infringement upon people's individual rights to freedom of religion if a government agent, a teacher, is enacting some sort of religion. Okay? So, looking at women's rights, over here we have Betty Friedan, and she is very important to the women's rights movement. Her book, The Feminine Mystique, and if you want to borrow it, I have a copy, is considered like the classic of women's protest literature. It criticizes the plight of women. It criticizes the cult of domesticity. It also criticizes the fact that women who are working make less. So it just goes at the women's rights movement from all angles. And she calls it in the book the problem with no name. This anxiety, this feeling of women that stay home, that feel unfulfilled, that feel like they're not doing what they're meant to be doing, calls it the problem with no name, and says that that's because society has forced you into the home and you're not supposed to stay there. Betty Friedan is the founder of NOW in 1966, the National Organization of Women. It calls for equal opportunity in employment. It calls for equal pay. It argues for change in divorce laws to make settlements more fair towards women in the care of children and also with the split up of money and assets. It seeks the legalization of abortion, which is the most controversial issue, but we will see that will pass in 1973. And they began advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution that will never actually be passed. And so it passes in Congress, but not by the states. But essentially, if the Equal Rights Amendment had passed, it would help bolster minority and women's rights in the economy, but also politically. Oh, here we go, the Equal Rights Amendment. It would be essentially what the 14th Amendment is for African Americans, the rights of citizenship. It would be that for women, and would basically say that they are considered equal under the eyes of the law, they are considered equal economically, and regulations should be put in place to make those things certain. It was passed in Congress but didn't get state ratification. Let me look up. In the early 80s, it required 38 states for ratification, and it did not meet that. And the reason that it did not meet that is many feared that the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, would deny things that they already have, like rights to financial support in cases of divorce, or would end, or might even end affirmative action, or it might end the special treatment women received in like protections in that way. So it never actually passed. And the opposition was spearheaded by Phyllis Schlafly, who fought against the ERA, while Betty Friedan is fighting for it. Okay? Looking at what gains of the women's rights movement. I know we just like touched on it, but you read it in your Henrietta. Affirmative action. And affirmative action is one of the biggest gains. Let me go back and read you exactly what it says so that I don't mess it up here. 1965, that's the date. 1965 requires employees on federal contracts to take affirmative action to ensure underprivileged minorities and women were hired. So in the federal government, it is trying, it's not a quota because quotas are outlawed, but it's trying to further include ethnic minorities and women in government jobs, but also at government-sponsored schools, so public colleges and admissions and those sort of things too. Roe versus Wade in 1973 legalized abortion, and from here on out, states had the right to determine, before that, states had the right to determine whether abortions were legal or not, so some were done and they were botched, and it was, that's why the women's right movement fought for legalized abortion to make it more safe and accessible for women. There will be some corporations that will pass equal rights when it comes to wages for women and will pay back wages to female employees who had not received equal pay for equal work, but that is not a federal, a nationwide thing. It was just some corporations that did that. We will see that Title IX guarantees equal access to girls for programs that boys usually benefit from, like sports, and it just says that the same amount of funding should be spent on boys and girls sports in schools and in colleges. We will see Sally Ride, our first female astronaut, and Geraldine Ferraro, our first woman to be on a presidential ticket, the vice presidential ticket, in 1984. She will be followed by Sarah Palin in, 2008. Another vice presidential candidate on the national ticket, and then Hillary Clinton getting closer and closer to actually having a female president. She was actually the Democratic nominee. She could have won the presidency. We could have had a female president. So we are getting closer and closer to that age, and we're getting to a point nowadays where we don't hear about firsts anymore. We don't hear about women being the first to do this or the first to do that. And that's a good place to be, because that means that someone's already done it, that a woman has already been in that position, already held that power. And I think the next step we have is the presidency. So women's rights has not faded away. There's still a feminist movement going on. It's just there have been so many gains that those firsts really aren't around anymore, which is a good thing. All right, so looking overall, let's look at the 1960s. Here's Muhammad Ali with the Beatles, which is fantastic. When we're looking at Kennedy and Kennedy's legacy, Kennedy was known for his style. He was known for being attractive, for being young, for having the perfect family. They called his time in the White House Camelot, because the musical Camelot was popular then. But essentially, that crashed and burned. It was a national tragedy when Kennedy was assassinated, and it felt like the country would not be able to get over it. Combine Kennedy's assassination with civil rights, women's rights, the Cold War, issues in Cuba, the beginning of Vietnam. All of it happened at the same time. And so it's an absolutely crazy, tumultuous time to be living, and it's all on TV as well, because TV is in almost all Americans' homes at this point. We will see the de-escalation of Cold War tensions, because after the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's whoa, we almost blew each other up. Maybe we should stop. And many historians, myself included, believe that if given the chance, Kennedy would have made more moves towards civil rights. It would have come to a head during his presidency if he had been reelected in 1964, and thus he would have been the one signing all those civil rights, like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the 24th Amendment, and all those federal pieces of legislation that had to do with civil rights. I truly believe Kennedy would have signed those things. He just didn't live to see that day, so it was his successor, LBJ, that did so. So let's look at LBJ. We will get to the Vietnam War as a whole, but we can largely lay the blame of the Vietnam War on LBJ's shoulders for expanding it when it was quite small during Kennedy and Eisenhower's presidencies. So it wasn't even really a war then. It was just we had sent troops, but LBJ expands that and makes it more of a war. But on his good side, we do have civil rights legislation, like all the things that we're going to talk about next Thursday and Friday. No president since Lincoln had worked harder on civil rights than him. It all came to a head during his presidency, and he did fight for those rights even if he himself didn't personally believe in those things all the way. The Great Society leaves a great legacy for Lyndon B. Johnson. They were heavily criticized by conservatives, but they did good things. He showed compassion for the poor. We saw a decline in poverty. He helped the elderly. He helped the environment. Yes, the programs were extremely costly, and eventually they required taxes to fund them, and then they kind of fell by the wayside. Some of them did, but some of them are still around. Medicare and Medicaid, super important. Funding for schools and funding more and more for schools out of taxpayers, out of taxes, that's still around today, and those ideas are Great Society ideas. But the issue here is Vietnam sucked away a lot of the positives of LBJ's presidency. The Vietnam War siphoned off much of the energy, much of the money that could have gone towards really waging a war on poverty. Instead, we were waging a war in Southeast Asia. All right, I believe that is all. Oh, no, I lied. So remember, all of this is happening at one time. Civil rights is happening. Women's rights is happening. JFK's assassination. We see, if I could think. We see Vietnam going on at the same time. The fight against communism. The fear that we're going to get blown up. Then we see the civil rights kind of turn a little bit more militant with the Black Power movement. We see student protests and hippies and counterculture and all this cool music all together, and the 1960s and the early 70s are just absolutely chaos. And to send you home with a good note, in the midst of this chaos, the best band known to mankind, besides Fleetwood Mac, the Beatles, during this time period. All right, have a good day. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being good for the sub. I will see you tomorrow, and I will check these notes.